In April 1996, the United States Air Force released a single photograph, and for the first time the public saw it. A shape that looked less like an aircraft than a mistake. No sharp edges, no sleek lines, a bloated, rounded fuselage, flat top, single tail fin. Pilots who flew it called it the whale. Engineers who saw it called it something else. Impossible. For over a decade, everyone in stealth technology believed one law was absolute. Radar-evading aircraft had to be built from flat panels, hundreds of them, angled precisely like a diamond cut to deflect light. It was the law that shaped the F-117. It was the law nobody questioned. Then, in near-total secrecy, at a dry lake bed in Nevada, one team broke it. They built an aircraft with curves, continuous, rounded curves, and somehow made it just as invisible to radar. It flew 135 times between 1982 and 1985. Almost no one knew it existed. It never fired a weapon. It never flew in combat. It was never even supposed to be remembered. But the physics it proved did not disappear when the program shut down. It went somewhere else, into a bomber that would become the most expensive aircraft ever built. This is the story of the aircraft the Air Force hid for 20 years and the mistake that turned out to be the future. Tacit Blue, Chapter 1, The Old Law of Stealth. By 1975, the aerospace engineers building America's next generation of combat aircraft believed they understood the rules of invisibility. Radar worked by sending out radio waves and reading what bounced back. To hide an aircraft from radar, you did not need to make it disappear. You needed to control where those radio waves went. Bounce them somewhere the enemy's receiver would never look, and the aircraft was, for all practical purposes, invisible. The problem was math. Calculating exactly how a radar wave would scatter off a given shape required solving equations so complex that in the 1970s, no computer could handle a curved surface. A sphere, a cylinder, a smoothly rounded wing. The physics of how radar waves behaved when they struck those shapes was not fully solvable. It was not a limitation of the aircraft. It was a limitation of computing power itself. Flat panels were different. A flat surface reflects radar in one predictable direction, like a mirror. If you built an aircraft entirely out of flat panels, hundreds of small angled facets, each one calculated individually, engineers could predict, with confidence, exactly where the radar energy would go. Pointed away from the threat, and the threat's radar screen stayed empty. This was the foundation of Lockheed's Have Blue program, the demonstrator that would become the F-117 Nighthawk. Its designers, working out of the Skunk Works in Burbank, built an aircraft so aggressively faceted that pilots joked it looked like it had been assembled from a kit of sheet metal, not designed at all. It was ugly. It was also, according to every calculation available, the only mathematically provable way to build a stealth aircraft. By the middle of the decade, this was not a theory competing with other theories. It was the consensus. Every serious stealth program in the country, inside Lockheed, inside the Air Force, inside DARPA's black budget offices, accepted flat panel faceting as the only viable path. Curve stealth was not considered a competing approach. It was considered, by most of the engineers who mattered, not a real option at all. That consensus was about to be tested by a problem faceted aircraft could not solve. While Lockheed's facets solved one problem, they created another. A stealth fighter like the F-117 was built to slip past enemy defenses, drop its payload, and leave. It was not built to loiter. It was not built to watch. And by the mid-1970s, the Pentagon had a different, more urgent requirement, one that faceted stealth could not answer. NATO planners were looking at the map of Western Europe and running the numbers on a Soviet armored advance. Thousands of tanks, thousands of vehicles, moving in formations that satellite photography and high-altitude reconnaissance could catalog only after the fact, hours or days too late to matter in a fast-moving ground war. What commanders needed was real-time tracking. An aircraft that could fly near the front line, point a radar at the ground, and watch enemy formations move as they moved. That requirement created a problem no one had solved before. A radar that watches the ground has to transmit. It has to send out a continuous signal and listen for the echo, and any signal powerful enough to track tanks at range was also powerful enough for Soviet radar warning receivers to detect from much farther away than the aircraft carrying it could ever hope to hide. The aircraft did not just need to be invisible to radar. It needed to be invisible while its own radar was on. This was a fundamentally different problem than the one Blue had solved. Faceted stealth like the F-117 was built around a single scenario: fly in, fly out, minimize exposure. But a battlefield surveillance aircraft would need to orbit for hours, radar active the entire time, close enough to the front line that a single detection could mean the aircraft's destruction. Engineers gave this problem a name: low probability of intercept, or LPI, a radar system designed so that even when it was transmitting, an enemy receiver would struggle to distinguish its signal from background noise. No existing aircraft could do both at once: stay stealthy in shape and stealthy in signal, while actively broadcasting a targeting radar toward the ground below. The two requirements pulled in opposite directions. A shape optimized to deflect enemy radar was not automatically a shape that could survive broadcasting its own. By 1976, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and the U.S. Air Force had a specification but no aircraft to meet it. They needed a demonstrator, something that could prove in the air that an aircraft could sit near a battlefield, radar on, and remain effectively undetectable. Lockheed's faceted approach, the only mathematically validated stealth solution in existence, was not designed for this mission. It was designed for the opposite one. The requirement went out to contractors. Northrop Corporation, a company that had spent the better part of 2 decades losing high-profile fighter contracts to Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas, took it on. What they proposed broke the industry's only rule. Northrop's proposal, submitted under the designation BSX, Battlefield Surveillance Aircraft Experimental, rejected the industry's only proven method. Instead of hundreds of flat, angled panels, Northrop's engineers proposed something almost no one in the stealth community believed was mathematically achievable: a fuselage built from smooth, continuous curves. The reasoning was counterintuitive, but it addressed a weakness the faceted approach could not fix. A faceted aircraft like the F-117 stayed invisible only within a narrow range of viewing angles. The flat panels redirected radar energy predictably, but only if the enemy radar was looking from roughly the direction the designers had calculated for. Move the observation angle, and a facet that had been reflecting energy safely away could suddenly send a strong return straight back at the threat. For an aircraft that needed to fly in and out fast, that narrow safety margin was tolerable. For an aircraft that needed to loiter near a battlefield for hours, observed from constantly shifting angles by multiple ground threats, it was a liability. A continuously curved surface behaved differently. Radar cross-section, the measurable strength of the radar echo an aircraft produces, is not eliminated by curvature. It is redistributed. Curvature, a surface with no flat panels or sharp edges, blending smoothly from one contour into the next, scatters radar energy across a wide range of directions simultaneously, rather than concentrating it into the sharp, predictable reflections a flat panel produces. Done correctly, a curved aircraft could present a low, relatively consistent radar signature across nearly any viewing angle, instead of a narrow cone of safety surrounded by dangerous specular return. The obstacle was the same one that had ruled curvature out of every serious stealth proposal for a decade. Nobody could calculate it. Predicting how radar waves scattered off a flat panel was straightforward geometry. Predicting how they scattered off a compound curve, where the surface bent in 2 directions at once, like the hull of a ship, required computational electromagnetics that, in the mid-1970s, existed only in early, unproven form. Northrop's radar cross-section team, led by engineers who had spent years on the company's earlier reconnaissance and flying wing programs, made a bet that the mathematics had caught up. Using newly developed computer modeling, methods for approximating how electromagnetic waves interacted with curved geometry, refined through the same DARPA-funded research initiatives that had validated Lockheed's faceting approach, Northrop's team argued they could now predict, with usable accuracy, the radar return of a smoothly blended surface. It was unproven. No aircraft using this method had ever flown. But if the mathematics held, a curved aircraft would solve the wide-angle exposure problem that made faceted stealth unsuitable for a loitering surveillance mission. DARPA and the Air Force, weighing a mission requirement that faceted stealth could not meet, took the bet. In 1976, Northrop received a classified contract to build a flying demonstrator. There was no guarantee the mathematics were right. There was no precedent to fall back on if they were wrong. The only way to know was to build the aircraft and put it in the air, in a program so secret that for the next 20 years, its own existence would be treated as more sensitive than most of the technology inside it. Building an unproven aircraft was one challenge. Building it without anyone knowing it existed was another. And for Tacit Blue, the second challenge was treated as seriously as the first. The program was funded through the Pentagon's black budget, a category of spending kept outside the normal congressional appropriations process, visible to only a small number of lawmakers on oversight committees, described in budget documents, if at all, under vague line items that revealed nothing about what the money actually built. Northrop's contract for Tacit Blue did not appear as a stealth aircraft demonstrator in any public record. It did not appear as an aircraft program at all. Access to the project was restricted through a system of compartmentalized security clearances, in which even individuals with top-secret clearance were not automatically entitled to know Tacit Blue existed. They needed a separate, specific approval, granted only if their work required it. At its peak, only a few hundred people were read into the program, spread across Northrop's engineering staff, a small circle of Air Force and DARPA officials, and the test personnel assigned to fly and maintain the aircraft. Many of the engineers building individual components of the aircraft never saw the complete design. They built subsystems in isolation, without the context to understand what the finished aircraft would look like or do. The aircraft itself was assigned the internal Pentagon designation BSX and the codename Tacit Blue, a name chosen specifically to reveal nothing about its shape, purpose, or capability, in keeping with a Defense Department naming convention designed to make classified code names as uninformative as possible to anyone without clearance. Even the code name was compartmentalized information. Flight testing took place at Groom Lake, a remote military installation on a dry lake bed in the Nevada desert, a location already the physical center of America's most sensitive aviation black programs, chosen for its extreme isolation, restricted airspace, and near-total absence of overhead observation. The same facility, decades later, would enter public consciousness under a different name, Area 51. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was simply the place where aircraft that were not supposed to exist were built, tested, and, when necessary, hidden. Security at Groom Lake governed nearly every detail of the operation. Flight schedules were arranged to minimize the window during which Soviet reconnaissance satellites, whose orbital paths were tracked and predicted by American intelligence, might pass overhead. Personnel commuted to the site aboard unmarked aircraft, arriving and departing without any public record connecting them to the program. Documentation was compartmentalized so thoroughly that a complete written history of Tacit Blue's development would not exist in any single accessible place for another 2 decades. This was the environment in which Northrop's curved surface gamble would either be proven correct or fail, not in a wind tunnel and not in a classroom, but in the sky above a hidden desert base, watched by a few hundred people cleared to know the aircraft existed at all. Solving the radar problem created a second problem, one just as severe. An aircraft shaped to defeat radar from every angle was not automatically a shape that could fly. Tacit Blue's fuselage was, by conventional aerodynamic standards, close to a disaster. Its designers had prioritized radar performance over airflow at nearly every stage, producing a shape optimized for invisibility rather than stability. A boxy, rounded body topped by a flat upper surface, a single vertical tail fin, and wings mounted in a configuration chosen for their radar behavior rather than their lift characteristics. Test pilots and engineers who worked on the program later described the airframe in blunt terms. It looked like something that had been welded together from spare parts, not designed by aerodynamicists. The nickname "the Whale" came directly from that silhouette, a wide, rounded body that seemed to belong in the water more than the sky. The specific aerodynamic problem was instability, not a minor handling quirk, but a fundamental characteristic of the airframe. Tacit Blue's shape was so aerodynamically unstable that without continuous computer correction, it could not maintain controlled flight. Left to its own aerodynamics for even a fraction of a second, the aircraft would begin to depart from stable flight, a tendency that would have made it uncontrollable by a human pilot reacting through manual controls alone. The solution was a quadruplex fly-by-wire system. a flight control system with no direct mechanical link between the pilot's controls and the aircraft's control surfaces, instead using 4 redundant computers to sense the aircraft's attitude many times per second and continuously adjust the control surfaces to hold it in stable flight. Without those computers actively working, Tacit Blue could not fly. This was not a new concept in isolation. Fly-by-wire systems were already in development elsewhere in military aviation, but applying it to an airframe this aerodynamically compromised, in an aircraft that also needed to survive the added structural and electronic demands of the radar system, pushed the technology to its practical limits for the era. 3 specific innovations, layered together, made the aircraft possible. First, the continuous curved fuselage itself, engineered through Northrop's new computational methods to scatter radar energy across a wide range of angles rather than concentrating it into predictable reflections. Second, the low probability of intercept radar system housed in the aircraft's belly, designed to broadcast a ground tracking signal that would be extraordinarily difficult for enemy receivers to distinguish from background electromagnetic noise. Third, a skin built from early radar-absorbent composite materials, layered over the airframe to further reduce the residual radar return. The curved shape did not already redirect. Each of these systems on its own was a significant technical risk. Combined into a single, aerodynamically unstable airframe with no historical precedent, they represented a genuine gamble that no amount of ground testing could fully resolve. Wind tunnel data could validate some of the aerodynamic assumptions. Computer modeling could validate some of the radar predictions, but whether a continuously curved, radar-optimized, aerodynamically unstable aircraft held together in the air by a quadruplex computer system could actually fly and actually stay invisible while doing it was a question that could only be answered one way. Someone had to fly it. The first flight came in 1982 at Groom Lake, watched by a small circle of engineers and Air Force officials who had spent years building toward this single moment. There was no ceremony, no public record, no name attached to the event that would ever appear in a press release. An aircraft that officially did not exist, lifted off a runway that officially did not exist, flown by a test pilot whose assignment to the program was itself classified. The test pilots who flew Tacit Blue over the next several years operated under conditions few military aviators ever experience. Every flight required coordination not just with weather and air traffic, but with the predicted overhead passes of Soviet reconnaissance satellites, schedules built around windows when the aircraft could take off, fly its test profile, and land again without a satellite passing overhead. Flights were often planned for early morning hours or timed around cloud cover, anything that reduced the chance of the aircraft's radar-defeating silhouette being photographed by someone who was never meant to see it. Inside the cockpit, pilots were managing an aircraft that could not be flown by feel alone. The quadruplex fly-by-wire system was making corrections many times per second, translating pilot inputs into an aircraft response that bore little resemblance to conventional aerodynamics. Pilots were, in effect, flying a computer's interpretation of their intentions, layered on top of an airframe that would not remain controllable without it. Test flights probed the edges of that relationship carefully, expanding the flight envelope in small increments, aware that a fly-by-wire failure in an aircraft, this aerodynamically unstable, carried consequences a conventional aircraft would not face. The nickname followed the aircraft from its earliest test flights. The whale was not an official designation. It was the name ground crews and pilots used privately, born from the aircraft's wide, rounded fuselage and flat-topped profile, so unlike anything else flying out of Groom Lake at the time. Some accounts from personnel involved in the program also recall the nickname the Alien School Bus, a reference to the aircraft's blunt, boxy silhouette against the desert sky, though this detail circulated informally among program staff rather than appearing in official records. Between 1982 and 1985, Tacit Blue flew 135 test flights, according to figures later released by the Air Force. Each flight added data, validating or challenging the radar cross-section predictions Northrop's engineers had made years earlier, based on computational methods no one had ever tested against a real flying aircraft. Slowly, across those 135 flights, the data began to answer the question the entire program had been built to ask: could a continuously curved aircraft actually stay invisible to radar at operationally relevant ranges, from angles a faceted aircraft could never have covered? The answer, as the test results accumulated, was yes. By the standard the program had been built to meet, Tacit Blue succeeded. The 135 test flights validated what Northrop's engineers had gambled on years earlier. A continuously curved airframe could achieve a radar cross-section low enough to be operationally viable, across a far wider range of viewing angles than any faceted aircraft could match. The low probability of intercept radar system performed as designed, tracking ground targets while giving enemy receivers little to detect. The mathematics that had been unproven in 1976 had, by 1985, been flown, tested, and confirmed. Curved surface stealth was no longer a theory. It was a demonstrated fact. And yet Tacit Blue would never become an operational aircraft. The mission it had been built to perform was, by the time the test program concluded, being solved a different way. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Air Force had been developing a parallel solution to the same battlefield surveillance problem. A large, non-stealthy aircraft carrying a powerful ground-tracking radar in a rotating dome mounted beneath its fuselage. This program, which would eventually become the E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, JSTARS, took a fundamentally different approach. Rather than trying to sneak a small, stealthy aircraft close to the battlefield undetected, JSTARS used a modified Boeing 707 airframe, flying well behind friendly lines, at standoff range far outside the reach of most battlefield air defenses, using its radar's raw power and range to track ground targets from a safe distance instead of relying on stealth to survive up close. For the Pentagon, weighing two solutions to the same requirement, JSTARS offered advantages. Tacit Blue could not. A converted airliner platform was far cheaper to build and operate than a small, highly specialized stealth aircraft requiring quadruplex fly-by-wire systems and radar-absorbent composite skin. It could carry a much larger, more powerful radar system with a bigger crew to process the data in real time. And critically, by operating at standoff range rather than penetrating close to the front line, it sidestepped the entire premise. Tacit Blue had been built around the assumption that a battlefield surveillance aircraft needed to survive up close in the first place. By the time Tacit Blue's flight test program concluded in 1985, the operational requirement that had justified its existence a decade earlier was being met by a different aircraft entirely, one that had never needed to solve the stealth problem at all. Tacit Blue had answered a question: could curved surface stealth work? That turned out to matter far more than the mission it had originally been designed to serve. The aircraft that never lost a test flight, that proved a mathematical gamble correct, was retired not because it failed, but because the battlefield it was built for had been won by different means. Two prototypes were built during the program's life. Neither would ever fly again after 1985, but the data they had generated, the accumulated proof that continuous curvature could defeat radar as effectively as faceting, across angles faceted stealth could never cover, did not retire with them. When flight testing ended in 1985, Tacit Blue's two prototypes were retired to storage, and the program that had built them was formally closed. By any conventional measure, this was the point where a canceled aircraft program disappears from history: mothballed hardware, a handful of classified reports, a workforce reassigned to other projects. For most black programs of the era, closure eventually meant declassification, sometimes within a few years, once the technology inside had been superseded or the strategic picture had shifted. Tacit Blue did not follow that pattern. For the next 11 years, the Air Force kept the program's existence classified, not because the aircraft itself remained operationally relevant, but because the technology it had proven still did. The curved surface radar cross-section data Tacit Blue had generated across its 135 test flights was not a dead end. It was a foundation. Even as the two prototypes sat in storage, the computational methods, the material science, and the flight-validated engineering principles behind them were being carried forward into Northrop's next major stealth program, one with a mission far larger than battlefield surveillance and a price tag to match. Revealing Tacit Blue's existence, its capabilities, or even the fact that curved surface stealth had been successfully flight tested, risked revealing information about that next program before the Air Force was prepared to disclose it. This is the quiet, often overlooked mechanic of black-budget aviation. A canceled program does not automatically become a declassified one. Classification is tied to the sensitivity of the underlying technology and its ongoing relevance to current or future systems, not to whether the specific aircraft that demonstrated it is still flying. Tacit Blue could sit in a hangar, unflown for a decade, and still be treated as one of the most sensitive secrets in American military aviation, because the thing that mattered was never really the aircraft. It was what the aircraft had proven was possible. Throughout the remainder of the 1980s, the small circle of personnel who had worked on Tacit Blue remained bound by the same compartmentalized security agreements that had governed the program during its active years. Many would not be able to discuss their work publicly for decades. Some elements of the program's full technical history would remain unavailable to researchers and historians well beyond the eventual declassification, adding to the difficulty of reconstructing a complete account even after the program was no longer secret. By the early 1990s, the Cold War that had justified Tacit Blue's original mission requirement was effectively over. The Soviet armored formations the aircraft had been built to track across the plains of Western Europe were no longer a live strategic concern in the same way, and the aircraft whose lineage Tacit Blue had quietly enabled was by then flying, publicly acknowledged, controversial, and already reshaping how the Air Force thought about strategic bombing. The technology no longer needed protection. The Air Force decided it was time to tell the story of where it had come from. In April 1996, the U.S. Air Force did something it rarely does with a black program. It announced Tacit Blue's existence voluntarily, releasing photographs, basic technical details, and a short official history of a program that had spent the previous 2 decades officially not existing. The announcement was deliberately timed and carefully scoped. The Air Force confirmed the aircraft's designation, its general purpose as a battlefield surveillance stealth demonstrator, its 135 test flights between 1982 and 1985, and its role in validating curved surface radar cross-section reduction. But large portions of the program's technical detail, including the specifics of its radar system and the exact composition of its radar-absorbent materials, remained classified even after the aircraft itself was acknowledged. Declassification, in cases like this, is rarely complete. It is a calculated release of exactly as much information as the government judges it can afford to give up. One of the 2 surviving prototypes was transferred to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where it went on public display, the first time in the aircraft's history that anyone outside a small circle of cleared personnel could stand next to it and see, in person, the shape that had spent 14 years as one of the country's most closely guarded secrets. The public and technical reaction when it came centered on a single fact that seemed almost to contradict itself. This aircraft had flown, successfully, more than a decade before anyone outside the program knew it existed, and it looked nothing like what most people, even those who followed military aviation closely, expected a stealth aircraft to look like. The F-117, unveiled to the public in 1988, had at least matched popular assumptions about what a stealth aircraft should be. Sharp, angular, aggressive. Tacit Blue matched nothing. Its rounded, ungainly profile seemed to belong to an earlier and less sophisticated era of aviation, not to a program that had quietly proven a mathematical breakthrough years before its more famous cousin ever left the ground. For aerospace engineers and historians who examined the declassified details, a different realization set in. Tacit Blue was not simply an experimental curiosity that had failed to reach production. It was the flight-tested proof of concept behind a curved surface stealth approach that had, by 1996, already been in operational service for years, carried inside an aircraft whose existence was no longer a secret at all, and whose shape, once you knew what to look for, was unmistakably related to the awkward whale now sitting in a museum in Ohio. The Air Force had waited 11 years after Tacit Blue's last flight and 20 years after the program began to tell this story, not because the aircraft still mattered, but because acknowledging it meant acknowledging where its successor had come from. The technical line from Tacit Blue to its successor is direct, documented, and unambiguous. In 1979, 3 years before Tacit Blue's first flight, and while the BSX program was still deep in its most secretive phase, the Air Force launched a separate, far larger classified program, the Advanced Technology Bomber, a project aimed at building a long-range, radar-evading aircraft capable of penetrating the densest air defenses in the world. Northrop won that competition too, beating Lockheed for a contract that would, over the following decade, become the B-2 Spirit. The connection between the two programs was not incidental. Northrop's radar cross-section team on the Advanced Technology Bomber was substantially the same group of engineers who had spent years solving the curved surface stealth problem for Tacit Blue. The computational methods developed to predict how radar scattered off continuous curvature, methods that had been unproven theory in 1976 and flight-validated fact by 1985, were carried directly into the B-2's design. The B-2's smooth, blended flying wing shape, so different from the F-117's aggressive faceting, exists because Tacit Blue had already answered the question of whether curved surface stealth could actually work in the air, not just on a computer model. This is the through line that connects a forgotten, unglamorous test aircraft to one of the most expensive weapons programs in American history. The B-2 Spirit, which entered service in 1997 at a program cost exceeding $2 billion per aircraft, owes its fundamental radar-defeating shape not to a breakthrough that happened during its own development, but to a decade-old, still classified demonstrator that most of the public would not learn existed until a year after the B-2 was already flying combat-capable missions. Northrop Grumman, the company. Northrop became, after merging with Grumman Corporation in 1994, the same corporate lineage that built Tacit Blue in near-total secrecy at Groom Lake nearly 2 decades earlier. The honest verdict on Tacit Blue is not a story of triumph followed by reward. The aircraft that proved curved surface stealth was possible was retired the same year its test program ended, its mission absorbed by a cheaper, non-stealthy alternative in JSTARS. It never received a production contract of its own. It never flew a single operational mission. By the narrow standard of its original battlefield surveillance requirement, Tacit Blue was a program that solved its technical problem and still lost, outcompeted not by a better solution to the same challenge, but by a different institution deciding a different approach was worth the money. A natural contrast sits alongside this story. Lockheed's F-117, built on flat panel faceting, went on to fly in combat over Panama and Iraq, becoming the public face of American stealth technology for a generation, while the aircraft that had proven a more advanced, more broadly capable stealth methodology sat classified and unflown in a hangar. Two philosophies, faceted precision built for narrow, fast-strike missions and curved surface stealth built for wide-angle survivability, arrived at stealth from opposite directions. History rewarded the first publicly and the second privately, in a bomber whose true origins would not be acknowledged for years. Tacit Blue never fired a weapon. It never carried a name the public would recognize while it flew. It spent its entire operational life as a rumor without even the rumor attached to it, an aircraft so secret that its secrecy outlasted its usefulness by a decade. It was never allowed to fight, but every stealth bomber that has flown since carries the shape it proved would work.